Okay, when I was asked to travel here today to give this talk, I was a little bit worried. The last time I gave a talk on this particular trip was to my daughter's grade school classmates, and she's now 42 years old. Okay. In 1969, I was a graduate student in geology at OSU, and I was contacted by Lois Jones, who was also in the geology department, and she asked me if I was interested in going to Antarctica. I thought about it for a while, about a half a second, and said, yes, certainly. At that time, both my fiance had just come back from one field season in the dry valleys, and a lot of my fellow graduate students in the geology department had also been down to Antarctica, and regularly attended the Institute of Polar Studies brown bag lunches there where people gave talks on their projects down there, so it didn't seem unusual at all. Lois also asked Kay Lindsay, who's right next to her in the photo. Kay was an entomologist, she's Australian, and her husband, John Lindsay, had also been down for several field seasons in Antarctica. And then, of course, she asked Terry Tickle, who was a very bright and enthusiastic undergraduate. Now, Lois was just finishing her doctorate using strontium isotopes to identify the sources of salts in the dry valleys. But the only thing was, she had to work from samples being brought in by other people, which was no way to do a satisfactory science project. You don't know what conditions the stuff's been collected under, you don't know what the surrounding environments are like, etc. So she really wanted to get out in the field to see everything, to get a clear picture of the field area and determine what was influencing the chemistry of her samples. Now, of course, previously no one had been allowed to go down, but the problem wasn't NSF, it was the Navy. However, they finally relented on the two conditions. First of all, it had to be an all-woman group. And second of all, our field area had to be at least 200 miles from McMurdo. Of course, in Columbus, a lot of reporters wanted to have interviews, and they always want you to have pictures of you doing something interesting, hence the rather ridiculous lab clothes that we're wearing. You'll find an awful lot of similarities between my photos and those of Terry. It was a trip to the same place, so what do you expect? So, of course, here's Terry and Lois and Kay. Our first trip on the Hercules didn't get very far. We were approximately 4 hours out of Christchurch when the pilot announced that because of headwinds, they were using fuel too fast, and that unless we wanted to glide the last 200 miles into McMurdo, we needed to turn around and go back, which we did. Luckily, we managed to get down the next day. I think for every one of you here, one of your first experiences of Antarctica is stepping out on the field, Williams Field, and nothing can quite match this weird feeling of being in this dazzling, white, flat, immense landscape. However, you sometimes discover that some things are not quite what you expect. Now, this is beautiful downtown McMurdo in 1969. According to the locals, it was also known during the summer melt season as McMurdo or McMurdhole. Observation Hill in the background was a really neat place with the gorgeous views from the top. And most of the time, whenever we were in McMurdo, we would also go for a hike to the top of the hill, just simply to get some exercise, especially after the big meals they served in the mess hall. And one time we even hauled, three of us hauled packs up there, simply because there was so much litter around, which annoyed us. So we took these empty packs up and managed to bring down as much litter as we possibly could. Now, the next unexpected thing was roughing it. This did not quite seem like roughing it. This was Building 137, which was for visiting scientists. It had carpets, it had paneled walls, it had a nice library of Antarctic books, it had a kitchenette with a bar, and even in the bathroom area, it had a glass-fronted shower door with a nice pegwood edged into glass. Now, in McMurdo, we were not supposed to fraternize with any of the enlisted men. This picture was actually taken near the end of the series, and when there was a beard judging contest we were actually asked to participate in. The fellow on the left was the winner for best, middle guy, longest. The one on the right is for best attempt. If any of the enlisted men used any bad language anywhere, they didn't have to use it with us, just anywhere within earshot, officers would give them an incredibly dressing down. This doesn't mean that the officers were necessarily all that trustworthy. The first day we arrived in McMurdo, after having an evening meal in the mess hall, they invited us to a Halloween party at the officers' wardroom. This was an annual event and so on. And as soon as we got there, they started asking us, trying to ply us with alcoholic drinks. Now, I didn't want anything alcoholic. I kept asking them for Coca-Cola. So eventually somebody brought me a glass of Coca-Cola. I took one sip of it. It was obviously had been laced with whiskey or bourbon or something like that. So I kind of pretended to drink it, wandered around, set it down unobtrusively, and then went and got a clean glass and an unopened can of Coke and got myself one that was slightly less adulterated. Now in McMurdo, you've already seen photos of the snowcraft school, survival school, and so on. Finally, on November 12th, they decided to take all the women to South Pole Station. Now, one of the reasons for this is because there were women there, this was the first time they were allowing a woman reporter to come down. Each year they allow a contingent of reporters to come down to report on people's projects. And this time they had along Jean Pearson from the Detroit Free Press. She was a science writer. And since they were taking all the reporters to South Pole Station, which they apparently do every year, that meant that she would be one of the first women at the polls. They decided we all should. So we got on a flight, which went rickety-rack to the pole and back, as the pilots put it. And this is flying up the Beardmore Glacier. Or actually, maybe flying down, one of the two. And of course, once we landed, I was sort of vaguely wondering who was going to step off first. I was quite happy for it to be Lois because she was responsible for putting us there. But luckily, somebody had the brilliant idea, lower the tail ramp, and we all traipse out together. So let's have a Welsh in the middle, and Terry and Lois, and Pam Young, a New Zealander, me and Kay, and Jean Pearson. And so we got a standard photo at the pole, and it was incredibly cold. You had to be careful not to smile too much, otherwise your teeth would start feeling extremely cold. And you usually had to keep rubbing your nose every few minutes or so, because otherwise it was quickly going to freeze up as well. I think the temperature is minus 50 Fahrenheit or something like that at that time. So anyway, it was a pretty neat experience, and we had a chance to visit the station inside. They asked us to leave some feminine items, which was kind of ridiculous considering what we were dressed in. I think Kay may have left a bobby pin or something like that. Now then, our main first field area, we were working out in the dry valleys. They're dry because the polar plateau ice stops short of the coast. The top one is at the head of Wright Valley. It's Air Devon 6 ice falls, and an area called the Labyrinth. The bottom one is Lake Bonney and Taylor Glacier coming down to it. Now, the first trip to do just simply a recon flight over the dry valleys turned out to be just like the Christchurch flight. I had never been in a helicopter before, so we climbed on the helicopter, went up, and we just went along a short way, and the thing was jouncing up and down and swaying back and forth and bouncing, and I thought, dear Lord, is helicopter flights like this? But after a few minutes, the pilot announced, sorry, the crosswinds here are way too dangerous, we're going back. So luckily we got back out for a recon flight after a couple of days, and that's when I took these photos. This is the dry valleys area. Each of them are largely clear of ice. They all have lakes. And they all have meltwater that drains from the side glaciers flanking the valleys. During the summer melt season, it gets above freezing. The glaciers melt, water drains down into the valley and down into the lakes. Now, the thing is, the draining is the opposite way. It doesn't drain out to the sea. So the lakes accumulate salts constantly because there's nowhere else for the water to go. And as a result, lakes have an awful lot of salt concentration. Vanda is about 10 times saltier than seawater. And the lake water is stratified in areas with different layers of different concentrations of salts. And it's also surprisingly warm, like Lake Vanda is 23 degrees C on the bottom. That's 73 degrees Fahrenheit, I think, which is something you don't quite expect. Our field program involved drilling holes in the ice capper of the lake. So that was our first major project, would be to drill holes in the lake, pump up water from the various stratified layers, and then go around the valleys collecting stream samples, glacier ice samples, bedrock, weathered bedrock samples, soil samples, you name it, up and down for each valley which fed into the lakes to see where the salts were coming from. Now, the interesting thing about the lake ice is it actually freezes from the bottom and sublimates and melts off the top. So the first valley we visited was Taylor Valley, and we were staying near Lake Bonney, which has got a really neat hut. Now that thing looks like it should be terribly cozy. It isn't, it was horribly frigid. Unfortunately, it actually had an oil drum heater in it, but nobody had told us about that, and we had no idea how on earth to run it. So as a result, we didn't actually try because we were afraid of either blowing up ourselves or perhaps burning down the hut. As a result, when all the heat that you make in the hut just simply rises up into that big A peak, which is no help. So we decided, a group of us, to actually sleep in the tiny little storage shed where at least body heat would keep the thing placed somewhat warmer. Luckily, a couple of days later, a helicopter finally arrived. We were expecting it with the supplies and equipment. And they showed us how to, oh, sorry, there we are outside of Bonney Hut. And the helicopter came, not only brought equipment and supplies, some guy who could show us how to run the oil drum heater, but also brought along Gene Pearson to stay with us for a couple of days. As you can see, they've got an helo landing pad at the pathway up to the hut. Now this is Gene Pearson helping us with doing some of the drilling out on the lake. A helicopter actually delivered a tent and a lot of our supplies out to the middle of the lake. It was about a mile hike from the hut out to our drilling point. We were using something called a cypriauger to drill through the ice. Now, as Terry's already mentioned, the ice at that point was about 14 feet thick. And I think, okay, it took us 3.5 hours to actually drill through it very slowly by hand with the cypriauger. But the next thing we found that pumping up water wasn't exactly straightforward. We had the electric pump. It burned out in less than a minute. So from then on, it was all hand pumping stuff. It took 2.5 hours to hand pump. We had some little 35-gallon drums, which had special linings and so on, to make sure they wouldn't contaminate the water. And it took 2.5 hours to pump up a 35-gallon drum of water from 6.5 meters. And then we took the next day, we lowered the hose down to 24 meters. But unfortunately, the tube kept collapsing. And in 4 hours, we managed to get about 1/4 of a drum of water, and that was about it. Now, we had other problems with stuff. Lois had oxygen and nitrogen tanks, which she was using for protecting the tanks in the towns out on the lake that she was using for chemical processing. Unfortunately, she found that the regulator valves on the tanks weren't really properly, they didn't fit. So we radioed back into McMurdo, and some days later they sent out new regulator valves. They were totally useless. They were for pressures up to 400 pounds. The tanks were 3,000 and 4,000 pounds. So if you put out those regulators on, you'd probably blow yourself to kingdom come. So we radioed again, explained it. So the next time they didn't send out any new valves or anything. They just sent out a guy who was probably absolutely certain that we didn't really know what the heck we were doing with the tanks. He came out on the lake with us, took a look and decided, yeah, you're right. These aren't really quite the right thing. So eventually they just simply took the tanks back and later on sent a new set of tanks which had proper regulator valves on them. Now, in addition to sampling the light weather, okay, here we are. We had an assortment of drums and other stuff. In addition to sampling the lake, we also did a lot of hiking around the valley area. The top right corner is actually from the aerial reconnaissance flight. It's a place called Blood Falls at the foot of Taylor Glacier, which is the one place where the continental ice spills over into the valley. And it's got a lot of iron oxide salts. So we took a lot of samples there. Now I shall distinctly point out that the object in that corner is not lipstick. It's a lens brush. You take the cap off and unscrew it, this little brushy thing comes out. We also hiked a long way up the valley. The glacier here is La Croix Glacier. When we first arrived, the weather was still quite cold and there was not much in the way of running water. But the day we visited La Croix Glacier, we could hear a gurgling sound. We realized ice is starting to melt, and this trickle of water from the edge of the ice of the glacier was slowly starting to head downstream, so across the dry stream bed. So we just sort of wandered around along with it, listening to the water and just watching it slowly spread along the channelway. It was really great. This is Kay Lindsay. Kay was an entomologist. She was collecting algae samples, which turned out to be loaded with springtails and mites. She was later on taken back to the camp, and she had something called Tolgren apparatus that you could use to separate all of the invertebrates from the background stuff. This is at the foot of one of the other glaciers. And the black stuff in the background is a kind of smeared out volcanic cone, so we also got rock samples from that as well. Now, at the end of our field season in Taylor Valley, when it was time to leave, we had to find some way to clean up. Now, for a toilet, we actually just had a little camp stool, which had a toilet seat instead of the usual bit of canvas or nylon cloth across it, and we had taped plastic bags underneath it. This, at the end of a number of weeks here, left us with a bunch of plastic bags that we had to dispose of. Back in the good old days, the bad old days, they were pretty careless about contaminating the environment. So to get rid of the bags, we dug a big hole in the ground and put them all there. We also had a toothpaste pit at both of our sites. This was just simply a small, shallow hole where if you wanted to brush your teeth, you took a mug of water, your toothbrush and toothpaste, walked outside, brushed your teeth, and then you would spit into the pit, pour out any of the stuff. And one day at Bonney Hut, Terry came in with her red parka, kind of spattered with white stuff, and she loudly announced, "We need a windsock over the toothpaste pit." I also have a note in my diary that one day I was able to spit into the toothpaste pit from 6 feet away. Now, we got back to McMurdo several times. Now, there's a huge number of people in McMurdo who never ever get to see a penguin while they're there. So once in a while, penguins will show up on the sea ice close to the town. Around New Year, this lone emperor penguin showed up, so a bunch of us went out to have a look at it. And then a few days later, an entire bunch of Adelie penguins. This was like a gold rush there. You had trucks loaded with people thundering across the ice. Everybody wanted to try to get photographs of the Adelie penguins. We did actually get a tour of Kate Boyd's penguin colony later, but I don't have pictures of that. And anyway, I shall state categorically that Terry did not grab that penguin. A Navy guy had grabbed it, shoved it in her arm and said, "Hold on to this while I take a photograph." And that's why she was holding on to a penguin. Also, just a few days after New Year, 2 icebreakers came fairly close to McMurdo. They were clearing a channelway for the big cargo ship that comes in each year. And because the sea ice was really solid, we went out with a group of other, mostly USARC people, to see if we could get some decent photos of the icebreakers. One was a Edisto, and the other was the Burton Island. The Edisto actually hailed us when we were somewhere fairly close to it and said, "Do you want to come aboard?" And we thought, "Oh, how are they going to do that?" Well, they just simply rammed the ship up onto the ice, shoved a ladder over the side. We climbed on it, and we stayed with the icebreaker for about an hour or so because we were gradually moving in closer to McMurdo. It was really fun. You could see how they worked, although you sometimes see pictures of icebreakers just sort of plowing straight through ice. This ice was so thick that what they did was back up the ship, ram it so the front half of the ship was actually sitting on the ice, and wait until the weight of the ship broke up the ice, and then back up and repeat it. And each one produced its own little channelway, and then the ice between the two floated out to create the larger channelway for the cargo ship. There's a few people who decided not to actually climb on the boat. And probably the most disconcerting thing was looking at our footprints broken up. When we finally got to near McMurdo, the Edisto stopped to pick up Admiral David Welch and some senators. The Admiral climbed aboard the boat in the ship and looked somewhat startled when we then climbed over the edge and took the ladder down. Luckily, there was an outboard there, which gave us a Byrd would hitch a ride on it to get back to McMurdo. Okay, next. Okay, we next headed out to Wright Valley and Lake Vanda. Now, the Navy had been so hard on the helicopters, they were either damaged, crashed and burned and so on, so they borrowed some of the Coast Guard helicopters to ferry people around. The Navy pilots were very contemptuous because these things looked really nice, but they had a very low weight carrying capacity. And pilots said they were probably designed to carry cargoes of ping pong balls. In Wright Valley, there was no hut there or anything, so we were living in Scott tents, which is typical for an awful lot of the field parties. But the one problem is that this was later in the season, and a moat was developing around the edge of the Vanda ice cover. This is at one end where it's a lot wider. It was narrower somewhat where we were at, but it still was making it more and more difficult to get out onto the ice. Sometimes they were sort of piling out little piles of rocks and so on to get closer to the ice edge. And the ice itself was becoming very nasty in places. You had to be careful to sort of stay in the thickened areas of white ice. One time, Lois went through nearly to her thighs. Luckily, it was within a meter or so of the shore. So it was an area where we had to manage to get back each time from the middle of the ice. And on one time, one foot went through the ice, but luckily I was able to pull it out and continue on. But it was a bit of a worry at this time of the season. One day when we did the usual sorts of setting up the tent, drilling like we did on Lake Bonney. And one day when we were out there, we heard this thing that sounded like a car or motor vehicle coming. And it turned out it was this vehicle called Gnat. And it's run by Kiwis who were staying at Vanda Station. Vanda was about a 45-minute walk from where our tents were at. And the guys there actually ended up having Christmas dinner with them. And they gave us a lift back to our tents on the Gnat, so that was pretty neat. Christmas dinner, they were running short of supplies, so it consisted of curry, canned beef stew, which was perfectly nice. But when we got back to our supplies, we actually gave them some big chunks of stuff that you saw into steaks. Also some frozen vegetables and so on to help supplement them. Now, everybody had their own projects. I was particularly interested in the lake strand lines around the edges. So I had an altimeter I used to measure the height differences between various beach ridges, and I collected sediment samples along them. This was actually a delta that came down across the beach ridges. They were all sloping and surprisingly hard to distinguish when you're actually on them, although they look good when you see them from a long distance away. We had several helo trips to do sampling up and down Wright Valley. By late in the season, the Onyx River was really running very, very well. And this is the Onyx with Lois doing some water sampling. Unfortunately, the first run along the Onyx, the helo pilots had put it off until very late in the afternoon. So we only got a short way down the river and then from the coast when they said, sorry, we're out of fuel. Come back and finish later. And we said, wait a minute. Lois needed all the samples done on a single day. So we kept some samples that had been collected already for a different purpose. And a couple of days later they came and we did the entire run in one day. The other areas where we were sampling were a couple of small ponds, which are near Lake Vanda. This one is called Canopus Pond, and it's got a ice cover in the middle. You can see the tent on the far side of it. Lois and Terry were actually doing some chemical processing there and staying for long periods at a time. So the tent had mattresses, a couple of sleeping bags, and so on, and then plenty of other supplies as well as all the chemical supplies and so on. One day while everyone was away from the tent, we had a couple of days of extremely high winds. When we came back, the tent had been just totally blown over. The 2 mattresses and one of the sleeping bags were floating in the moat. The waders were floating upside down in the moat. And one of the sleeping bags was out in the middle of the ice. And boxes of chemicals and so on were just sort of strewn all over the landscape. The other pond there, which is noted, somebody said it's the saltiest one. That's Wikipedia says it's the second saltiest one on the planet. But it has got such a high salt concentration, it does not freeze even in the dead of Antarctic winter. So we did quite a bit of sampling around the edges of that. And you get typical salt weathering on the boulders, and it's Terry, of course, in front of one of the boulders. Shortly before we were going to head back from Wright Valley, at the end of the field collecting season there, we had the bright idea that we'll try collecting an air sample and see if the guys would load it on the helicopter. So this was Kerry collecting an air sample. Unfortunately, we couldn't get the seal done really properly, and it tended to collapse on itself. It was an interesting idea anyway. The other thing we had to do was we had gotten what we thought were curtains from a grade school class. However, yesterday I met the woman who actually made the curtains, and she said that they weren't. So anyway, we decided that we had to, obviously curtains aren't much use on the tent, but we decided we would string them up to take some photos. Carrie had to go at modeling them. I'm not certain where she got the blue band because it says rear end Big Welch. So as a result, this became the only tent with curtains in the Antarctic. But wait, there's more. At the end of the field season, some reporter had supposedly written that we all said that, no, we never wanted to go back to the Antarctic again. And this was pure baloney. Both Lois and Terry applied to go back again in later years. And I managed to get back there just 2 years later as a field assistant to my husband. He was interested in glaciology, and we were going to be working at Reserve Glacier, which is one of the big alpine glaciers that comes down into Wright Valley. Now you'll notice these glaciers all have very high cliffs right on the base of them, and they also have some ripples along the surface. They're extremely slow moving. I think Reserve has been measured at roughly 3 meters a year movement along the main trunk of it. It is possible to get up on the glacier surface if you hike all the way up the moraines out to an area where it's relatively smooth, and then you can come down again. That takes an hour or so to do that, which is not very satisfactory. Now these glaciers all do what is known as dry calving. Essentially they're frozen down to the base, so as a result the top moves while the bottom is stuck, and at the edges they become overhanging, so stuff breaks off constantly. It produces an apron of ice around the base of the cliff, which slowly either sublimates or melts. We were staying in a Jamesway hut, which didn't even show up in the Reserve photo. You go back, but it's someplace, there's a tiny little dot about near the bulge on the left-hand side, which is the Jamesway hut, which gives you a bit of a scale of the glacier. Previous field seasons had scientists had actually cut tunnels into the base of the glacier so that they could see what was happening to the sediment of the base and measure chemistry of the ice and so on. We didn't do that, but we found that the tunnel actually made a very good walk-in freezer for all of our supplies. And here's the two of us at the James Boy Hut. That's my husband, McSaveney. Our hair was darker then. And this June, we just celebrated our golden wedding anniversary. Now, what Maury wanted to do was to measure deformation on Reserve Glacier to see how the waves were forming. This was taken up on the top of Reserve, looking over at Bartley Glacier, which has waves that are very, very similar to the ones on Reserve. And in order to do that, we had to be able to get up onto the glacier nearly every day because we wanted to put in inclinometers to see how fast the ice is tilting as it moves. And then there was also a whole network of grids with stakes, and we're constantly measuring the distances between the stakes to see how it's slowly changing. We did that with a steel tape, if you can believe it. These are being the good old days and no such things as GPS and so on. Well, in order to quickly get up onto the glacier, Maury had the materials and was allowed to construct a ladder up the cliffs. While it was under construction, I was getting more and more nervous because about getting up and down this thing. And finally, the night before I was supposed to make my first trip up, I actually had nightmares about just totally losing my nerve and not being able to climb it. However, when the day finally came, first of all, I just went halfway up the ladder and back down and thought, oh, that's not too bad. It's probably next time I went all the way up. There's more ladders at the upper sections. And after that, it became very routine. We did it every day for most of our stay there. This is Maury carrying plastic tubing to use for, he had to drill a hole using the same sort of cypriolga that we used on the lake ice, and then fit plastic tubing down it. And then we had an inclinometer inside it to measure how the tilt was changing. And although we don't have any pictures, there's a scatter of dozens of stakes all over the area, which we measured distances between nearly every day. Unfortunately, because we found that wind affects the tape as you're holding it. The time of the day with the least wind is just after midnight. So we sort of reversed our schedule. We were mostly sleeping during the day and going up on the ice after midnight. And if we had visitors drop in, they always came during the day, of course. And this is me up at the foot of one of the waves, looking heroic or whatever. Now, I think like most of you, I found Antarctica to be totally fabulous, fascinating, beautiful place. And I never got back to it again, but it's still been quite well to travel back. About a decade ago, I was watching television and a documentary came on McMurdo Station. And in the documentary, there were women. There were women as scientists, there were women working in the kitchens, there were women working on the vehicles, and so on. The thing was, the narration made absolutely no mention of the fact that there were women there. That told me one thing: it was so commonplace having women there that it wasn't worth mentioning. And that made me feel that things were finally right, and I felt really warm inside. And so that's about the end.
Were you able, excuse me, were you Since you've been in the building here.
Nope.
I would expect there would be sediments or something. Rocks that was collected.
No, I haven't seen them in 40-something years.
Anybody else? We have a little bit of time. Ladder that you built to climb up.
There were several ladders, actually. The biggest one was the bottom.
Well, and you didn't take it down and take it home. That's just still.
Oh, yeah, of course, we sort of deconstructed it on the way back, took out the upper ladders first, and then last one we had sort of unfixed the top of it, which had been tied onto some pipes that were set down into the ice to keep it steady. And once it was down, we kind of dragged it down. And
But then when the pipes went down, they're still there? Or did you pull them up?
I don't think the pipes were, I'm not really certain about whether the pipes are still there. They did have stabilizing stakes and pipes at the top to keep it steady when you were walking up it. But it all came down at the end of the field season. But I think it was just left there in case any other field party wanted to use it.
Last one?
Mind if I join you for a second? I wanted to tell you about some other changes that have taken place since you were there.
Yeah.
And I want people who wouldn't know that in the audience, many people do, but not all do, that we no longer bury plastic bags of waste. And in fact, we have incinerator toilets at Lake 4, and we do allow evaporation to get concentrated gray water, and we take all of this out. So a lot of changes with respect to the environment. I think when I saw you climbing those ladders, I don't think we would be
Health and safety measures.
I'm so glad you're here with us today. But the other thing I wanted to let you know is you showed some pictures of McMurdo Station. There's a bit of change, but not a huge amount since those days.
The online pictures of what it looks like today.
Yeah. So
a lot of bigger buildings around now. But,
there are a few bigger buildings, but some of the original structures are there. They got set up in 1955. But what I really wanted to tell you, and I'm very excited about this, is we, as of this season, have embarked on a complete overhaul of McMurdo Station. I think about 6 or 7 years from now, you won't recognize it. It's not going to be the old mining town that it was. We call it the Antarctic Infrastructure Modernization for Science. And people have been talking about accommodation for women. And I just want to say that at South Pole, the modern South Pole, we have small but individual rooms so people could have their privacy and so forth. That's where we're going with McMurdo. So I think it's, we have people who work all through the night and whatnot, and it's just a better situation. You can avoid transmitting diseases and colds and whatnot, and all of that stuff. So, but anyway, I'm really struck by your presentation, and I thank you so much, and thank you to Terry as well. I'm overwhelmed emotionally thinking about the things you pioneered, but I also feel so privileged to be able to carry that forward.
All I know is we had a great time there.
That's abundantly clear, and the fact that you're 50 years married to a person you worked with there is also heartwarming. Thank you.
I also might mention that lake bays and lake lines that you could see were smaller ones, but I've read papers recently that they now think that lakes covered the entire floors of Wright Valley and Taylor Valley. They've got evidence of that, and I'd really be interested to see where the actual extent of these much bigger lakes. Okay.
Also, the building that you stayed in McMurdo was building 160, was building 137, which was the NSF housing for most of my career. So those pictures that were on the wall were there when I stayed there between 1990. So it looks very much the same as when you stayed there.
All right, let's take a short break. Thank you, Eileen.